Good afternoon, everybody. It's Megan Reitz here. I'm Associate Professor of Leadership and Dialogue at Ashridge Executive Education. Today, I'm going to be talking about sexual harassment, which is a huge debate at the moment. And it fits into my research in a number of ways. My interest is in how we meet with one another, listen to one another, and hear one another inside organisational systems, and all the many reasons why those organisational systems make meeting, hearing and listening really quite tricky for us to do well. So I'm going to see this current debate of sexual harassment through the context and the lens of our research on speaking truth to power. And Speaking Truth to Power is a research project that myself and my co-researcher, co-author John Higgins have been running for the last few years here. So what I'm not going to try and do is cover everything in the territory of definitions, legal context, history. This is going to explore specifically a major issue that is emerging right now, and that's how do we talk about this subject? And why on earth do we keep on silencing ourselves about this subject? And why do we silence others and force what is a really important conversation underground, and we sort of disappear it? And once we disappear it, of course, we can't clearly address it. So I'm going to give a little bit of context on the debate, look at this explosion of stories and why it matters for organisations. I'm going to introduce the research on Speaking Truth to Power and look at why do we sometimes speak up about issues of sexual harassment and why do we sometimes not? And if we're in positions of power, how do we listen well? How do we invite a conversation here? And then finally, I'll say a little bit about what you can do from an individual, team and an organisational perspective to help listening and speaking up. And then I'll point to a few further resources as well. So please do type in your comments and questions in the chat box. I will attempt to do the extremely tricky multitasking feat of looking at them whilst continuing to speak, which is definitely something that my other big project, which is on mindfulness, says I probably shouldn't try and can't do anyway. But I will attempt that, so bear with me. I've also got my co-researcher and author, John Higgins, on the line as well, and he might at some point type in some further comments or respond to some of your questions too, so you can look out for that. So let's look at the context. A few people's faces you will recognise there. There's no doubt that sexual harassment is one of the major global debates at the moment, and it sits within a much wider debate around gender. And now, obviously, you've got Harvey Weinstein there, who many see as instigating the current level of conversation around the subject. You've got Time magazine. They awarded the Silence Breakers Person of the Year for 2017. You've got a couple of French actresses there. So Catherine Deneuve, she famously recently has been in the headlines for writing a letter defending men's right to, quote, hit on women. And then most recently in the last few days, Deneuve's apologised for that. Then you've got Brigitte Bardot. You may have heard her in the last few days. She's saying that women complaining of sexual harassment in the film industry are in, quote, the vast number of cases, hypocritical, ridiculous and uninteresting. So I guess we know where she stands on the subject. We've got the UK government. I don't mean to put them all in there, but we have, the resignation, obviously, of Sir Michael Fallon, who was a senior member of the cabinet. We have a situation where female researchers and aides are using a WhatsApp group to share information about sexual harassment and abuse. We have Donald Trump, president of the US, accused of sexual misconduct. And then I've featured just 2 companies here who have been in the news recently. That's Uber and also Fox News. But if you look in the papers, I mean, just recently, BBC, Amazon, to Oxfam, you know, you name it, companies have been in the headlines when they haven't wanted to be around this subject. So let's look at why all this matters for organisations. I'd argue it's relevant both because of the business case and the moral case. Now, before I go on, I like images in my presentations. So 2 days ago, I was there searching on Big Stock for my images for business case and moral case. So I put in those phrases, business case and moral case. And the way I have it set up, it returns to me the images that are most popular when people search for these phrases. So these images came up, which I just found was really quite fascinating. And it brought to mind to me that, you know, the issue of sexual harassment is situated within a far wider and longer running construction about gender and how women and men are perceived in society. And I will say more of that later, but I did find it fascinating that these 2 images were 2 of the most popular images for business case and moral case. So in the business case, you've obviously got reputation. We've seen some organisations brought to their knees by social media over scandals that are then picked up by the press. So that's one reason why organisations are concerned, worried. Then you've got engagement and performance. We know that unwanted sexual advances affect the receiver, the target, if you like, but we also know that it affects the people around them. So it tends to develop a culture of oppression and anxiety. So engagement suffers more widely than just the person on the receiving end. But it's true to say that certainly most of the people I've spoken to who have suffered sexual harassment left their jobs as a result. So it becomes a talent issue as well. You know, we're losing people from organisations needlessly. So in addition, in organisations that I and my colleagues have worked in, we've also seen that the formal chain of command, if you like, the leadership, hugely undermined when there's intimate relationships between senior and junior people or rumours around sexual harassment. So again, it really tends, stories circulating really affect the culture and the level of engagement and performance. I mean, it's interesting that it's still seen, though, as an issue for women. A client of mine speaking to me about this subject very recently said, listened to me and, you know, was very, very interested, and then said, yes, this is a women's leadership development issue, isn't it? And which is, you know, in a way, it's ironic. It shows again how this debate fits within the way we construct gender. I'd argue that it's far from being a women's issue. It's much more of a collective issue. And the business case can kind of show us that. And then there's the moral case. And I do sometimes wish we don't always have to lead on the business case for some of these things, because I'm hopeful that the moral cases should be enough for organisations and individuals to act. But there you go. The moral case, many of us spend most of our lives inside organisations. So it defines us. We spend years inside organisational structures. And you could argue that those in power in those organisational structures have a moral duty to create a culture which is both respectful and safe, and ensure people within their authority are not submitted to what can be devastating pressure and psychological, sometimes physical danger. So I would argue that there's the moral case as well. However, this is undoubtedly hugely complex. You know, when we start talking about morality, and I will talk about this more today, morality is what we call a social construct. In other words, it's about values. It's subjective. There are no objective facts to find within that. So this debate very much reflects what a particular era and a particular context sees as okay, sees as right at a particular time. So this whole debate is moving and shifting. I mean, it's moved and shifted hugely over the last few years even, and it has to be seen within that context. So let's look now at our research. We've been exploring speaking truth to power since before people knew what speaking truth to power meant, and certainly before Oprah used it in her speech. We wanted to know why people speak up about certain issues and why they silence themselves, and why those in power often help some subjects and people speak up and silence others. And at the time when we instigated the project was around the time that VW emissions scandal came out. And that was one example of an organization that I think most people thought was fairly invincible being brought to its knees because of something that was going on and that people knew about but weren't speaking up about, or if they were, they weren't being heard. So there was a big desire from organizations to try and understand how they can improve dialogue just so that this sort of stuff wouldn't happen to them. And then there's also the issue around ideas and innovation. So increasingly we're needing our organizations to be disruptive. You know, that's the cool word at the moment. We need new ideas. We need, you know, paradigm shifting ideas and challenges. Well, that isn't going to happen if the only people that can speak up in an organization sit in the leadership team. So again, we've got organizations really interested in how to develop dialogue. And we know that dialogue and people's perceptions about whether their opinion counts is also a major factor in engagement and therefore performance. So this was the sort of context that kicked us off. We have done well over 100 interviews. We've done various organizational interventions now, some quite short and some lengthy over a number of years, in fact. And we've been doing what we call a cooperative inquiry, so running a couple of groups over a period of time with people in there that are interested in changing organizational dialogue and finding out how they go about that and the challenges that involves. So we've come at this from a number of methods, and in fact the project's very much continuing this year. And John and I are in the process of writing our findings so far up in a book. More recently, we've dug far deeper into the issues of gender and sexual harassment to understand silence and to understand the speaking up elements in this. And I mean, what our research as a whole uncovers, and definitely what our research into sexual harassment uncovers, is this is a hugely complex area, and it often gets simplified, as it is being simplified at the moment by a number of camps and blaming the other camps. So speaking up, our capacity to talk about this is relational. Yes, it happens when a person has the courage and conviction to say something, but it's influenced, of course, it's influenced by whether those in power, and that's not necessarily limited to hierarchical power, but when those who are perceived as powerful invite or suppress speaking up. So we know from our research that those in power often value their own opinion 2 or 3 times that of others. So that means they can be fairly blind, fairly unaware of how their behavior is experienced because they can't or don't want to hear from other people. So Also, we know that the topic of sexual harassment and of speaking up generally is influenced by a far wider cultural system, which we collectively create. We're collectively creating inside our team, organization, and society. And that way that we construct that's constructing what we call the rules of the game. How are things done around here? What's allowed and what's not allowed? Who has power? What do the labels man and woman mean? What are the assumptions and the expectations that are conveyed in particular contexts when you use those labels? What does it mean about whose opinion counts more than others? What does it mean around what is acceptable behavior and what is not? And oh my goodness me, is it complex? It changes fundamentally according to the different contexts that you find yourself in. So our research is interested in the complexity of it, not really in kind of simplifying it. We think that you need to understand and appreciate how complex it is in order to figure out how best to approach it and improve situations. So I have identified 5 big issues that are relevant in speaking up. And they are relevant in the debate on sexual harassment. These are the 5 areas. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about these 5 areas from both sides of the coin. First of all, we're going to look at the courage to speak up. So how do these 5 issues impact whether someone chooses to speak up or not? Then after that, we'll go on and talk about, well, how do these 5 issues influence whether people in power successfully and effectively invite others to speak up? So let's start here. Let's talk about conviction. Conviction is about the belief in the value of my own opinion. So rather simplistically, you know, if I don't feel that I have a valuable opinion, if I don't feel that I have something valuable to say that's important, I may choose to silence myself. Now, what we've noticed in the sexual harassment debate is conviction about how serious various types of behaviour are differs enormously. It's very subjective. A report, quite an interesting report a couple of years back, was on the Paris subway, where 100% of women who they surveyed, 100% reported they'd been on the receiving end of sexual harassment on the subway. However, many of them stayed silent because they really almost didn't give it a second thought because they thought it was normal. So they discounted any concern that they had. They believed that their concern really in the wider society wasn't valuable because it was just the way things were done around here. And the report said that, you know, they figured that if they didn't like being sexually harassed, it was up to them to change their route or their clothes or their response. So, and that's mirrored by a number of the interviews that I've had as well of people just being unsure about whether they have a right to speak up about anything. You know, is it wrong? Well, is it supposed to be, you know, isn't this just expected? You know, do I have anything valuable that I have to say here? Do I have a right to say anything? So that's conviction. Also in the mix here, of course, this is a massive one, is risk. You know, if I'm subjected to sexual harassment, what do I believe will happen if I say anything to certain people? Yeah, what will the consequences be? You know, there you got down in the corner there, quote, brilliant quote from Charles Handy. The world may admire the truth tellers, but few will want to employ them. You know, a brilliant quote and a rather depressingly true one. So the most common responses that I heard as to, you know, almost inevitably, why didn't you speak up, was I'll lose my job. HBR, I noticed last week, had an article that looked at sexual harassment within the restaurant industry. And they reported that one of the most common reasons that people said that they wouldn't speak up was that, well, they'd lose their tips, they'd lose money. And of course, you know, then it's quite easy for some people to judge and kind of go, oh, well, for goodness sake, you know, you should speak up anyway. But no, actually, if you're in a position where you are absolutely reliant on that money to support a family, no, of course, you know, losing your tips is a major, massive risk. The other risk that's come up quite a bit in the conversations I've had is around how I'll be seen. So firstly, well, I'll be ashamed, because if I speak up about this, they'll think, whoever they are, they will think that I brought it on myself. I heard somebody saying, you know, I'll be seen as a girl. And I mean, the risk in reputation is also a major factor about people speaking up. You know, real fear as to how they'll be judged, which is appalling when you think about it. We tend to have a situation where we're judging the person, the target, rather, or at least before, we're judging the perpetrator. The Guardian at the weekend was talking about Monica Lewinsky, and a quote really struck me. It said, 20 years seems to be the amount of time it takes for the world to take a breath and reevaluate a demonized woman. Now, I'm not going to enter into the whole Monica Lewinsky debates and that side of things, but that phrase, I think, is really interesting. And it is one that silences, you know, and I think that's a lot of, that really resonates with a number of people that I have spoken to. There's also in risk a kind of judgment around whether there's a risk of danger from the sexual harassment. So a sort of judgment on where on the spectrum it lies, you know, is it banter at one end and a kind of a laugh versus physical danger? So, you know, one person that I spoke to in the banking industry, you know, said, well, you know, I didn't really, this kind of links in with conviction here. I didn't, you know, I wouldn't say anything. It was just a bit of fun. Until, that is, I was pushed up against the car in the car park. So there's a subjective judgment as to, well, do I have to speak up? Do I face any danger here? Do I have a valid opinion here? Then we got politics. Politics is about awareness of the political games that are played inside the organization. So this is all about agendas, networks, what it takes to get ahead, and all about how people are relating. And it can be quite tricky for people to navigate. But we do know that when we speak up, it has political consequences. And when we speak up, we often consider the political arena that we find ourselves in. So examples, I suppose, where it comes into the merging really of politics and risk is with interviewees who say, you know, I can't say anything, he's my boss, and then I wouldn't get promoted. Or, you know, it would affect my career. You know, it's gonna disturb various people's agendas here. I've also had people saying, well, who can I speak to? Because if you look at the people in power in my organization, well, this was one example, it's a boys' club. You know, it's a network up there of political friendships. How do I speak into that? Seriously? You know, how do I do that safely? Yeah, I've got to be aware of who knows what. Another example of somebody I interviewed who was in an estate agent, working in an estate agency. And everybody around them was the daughter, it seemed, of the boss's friends. So everybody in the organization was intimately connected with the boss. And of course, it was the boss that was the perpetrator of the sexual harassment. So again, you know, where does that put you in terms of speaking up? Another story, before I move on, of a barrister who felt pressured to sleep with a clerk in order to get any work, again, and that was just how it was done. That's what was assumed acceptable. So she was also, just reflecting on the fact that there was then a tendency to jump to judge her before judging him, which I think is also quite an interesting dynamic. Here's the next one. This is social awareness. This one is fascinating. This is about labels, how we label people, how we label context, how we, as I said, how we figure out the rules. So we've got labels which convey status and power and expectations. So, for example, cleaner or young aspiring actress. So some of these labels convey differently in different situations who has the right to speak up, who will be heard. They convey status and authority. And I was fascinated actually in looking at Time magazine. They had a bit on cleaners, and particularly a Mexican cleaner in the US. Really, and it's a whole area that I hadn't really thought about before. But of course, female cleaners in hotels are subjected to sexual harassment a lot. But because of their relative social standing and that label, they find it incredibly difficult to speak out and be heard. So, and they're aware of that. And so they shut themselves down because of the way we all construct these kind of labels. And then there's labels which lay down what's acceptable in a particular context. So three fascinating interviews, one with, as I've mentioned before, one with a lady who works at an estate agency, one on the trading floor, and one in a pub. And they all said, well, what can you expect? It's a estate agency, it's the trading floor, it's the pub, it's just what you have to put up with. So again, there are certain labels, certain places where we seem to have come to an understanding that it is just how you get along. You just have to put up with it. Then there's labels which affect whether someone should speak up or not. Now, I've spoken to a few men who have been subjected to sexual harassment, and they have a very interesting insight as well on how being a man, labelled a man, means, but you just simply don't experience sexual harassment. It's not possible. It's only women that experience it. Or, if you do experience sexual harassment as a man, well, you're lucky. You should be pleased. You certainly shouldn't complain. So they were just reflecting on how silenced they felt because of the labels applied to them. And also, in some cases, being a man means you don't have to speak up. I found in some conversations, it's the woman's job to speak up about sexual harassment. It's the target's voice. It's their responsibility to speak up. If you're an observer or if you're a man, then you are not so responsible. These are just some of the phrases and words that have come up in the interviews that I've done. So the question, I suppose, to you listening is, what's your experience with labels? How do you label yourself? How do you label your workplace? And what consequences does that have on whether you feel capable of speaking up about sexual harassment or about other subjects? All these labels convey who has the right to speak, who has the right to be heard. I find it fascinating. And we're all constructing those labels moment by moment. So the final one I will go through is judgment. So this is the skill of knowing what to say, who to say it to, when to say it, and how to say it. So what I have found from the stories I've heard is it can be really tricky to speak up directly to the perpetrator. I've had a couple of examples where people have really thought hard about how they were going to basically tell the person to stop. And then when they did, and they did it well, were told that they were being oversensitive, or told, oh, for goodness sake, you don't have any sense of humour. It was only meant as a joke. So it seems to require, going back to some of the other issues, it does seem to require an awful lot of confidence and conviction to speak up here, and to be prepared for what might come back. And it really sort of tragic stories that I've heard on women that have spent a long time trying to figure out what to do, and then when they do speak up, you know, they're met with that. But I'll come on to that a little bit more in a tick. I did have, you know, and I think there are situations where one story comes to mind in Judgment where a lady that I was talking to was describing, I'm afraid, rather a familiar situation, if you're a woman, and it was the fact that her boss appeared completely incapable of meeting her eyes, and permanently had a conversation to her chest, to the degree, I mean, it was really embarrassing her, distracting her, as well as a number of people around her. And she got to the stage where she, you know, far from using judgment, she just one day just told him straight and just said, Bob, or whatever his name was, Bob, can you please look in my eyes? Oddly enough, he was so surprised it never actually happened again. But I think there is, you know, judgment is all around how do you get the support as well to figure out how to say something, how to speak up, and who to speak up to. And very often it's not the perpetrator, it's somebody else, and it's somebody else that you trust. I think the other thing to say here on judgment is that people assume that it's the target that has to do the speaking up. But it should be all of our jobs. You know, there's no reason why, if we're observing this happening, why do we think that it's the target's job to say something? We should really all feel equal responsibility, men and women here. I had an interesting conversation with someone who was commenting about gender. And he said, you know, if I heard a guy commenting on my daughter's body, I'd challenge him about it without hesitation. So I would just, you know, I would absolutely say something. But would I also challenge to a guy commenting on a mutual colleague to whom I'm not related? And if I wouldn't comment, then why wouldn't I? And really sort of social norms, he was saying, permit me to speak up in the first example, knowing that, you know, as a father, absolutely you speak up. But in the second example, social norms might require me to assess the risk of challenging comments in the workplace, for example. And he also referred to the pushback he might get because it's deemed, you know, none of my business, or being overly PC. So there's something around judgment that asks a question of, well, whose responsibility is it to speak up? You know, and how do we then do that well and skillfully so that it's heard? Which kind of brings us on to the other side of the coin. So the other side of the coin is how we listen up. I hope that you can see that so much of, you know, speaking up depends on whether there's someone that's going to listen. And if it's perceived that there is just nobody that's interested or that's going to listen, guess what? People silence themselves. So let's look at that. Let's look at the wisdom to listen up. And I'm pausing, I can see that John's putting in a couple of examples here. And I'm just running my eyes down some of the comments so far. Great, okay. So let's look at these 5 issues again from listening up perspective. Here we go, conviction. Now conviction means the belief in the value of others' contributions. Now, we all want to hear from other people, don't we? Yeah, we're all wonderfully approachable and we definitely value what people have to say, don't we? Absolutely. Yes. However, if we're really honest, we kind of value what some people have to say more than other people. And we want to hear about some subjects more than other subjects because we're human beings. So there's something around understanding. Again, this links into labels that I'll talk about in a bit. But do you really value other people's opinions? And whose opinion do you value more than others? And we really need to check that out, because we are often judging some and closing them down, and they pick it up. So we've got a few stories in this area where those in power just, haven't wanted to know about sexual harassment because it's just tricky and they just don't know how to respond. So we've had a few examples where, I took it to my boss or I took it to a colleague and they were just embarrassed. They didn't want to know. They thought, oh my God, don't even tell me. If I don't know, then I don't have to do anything about it. It's also an area where it was interesting when we've developed a diagnostic around speaking truth to power, a sort of mini survey that we often use with clients. And we used it for one client, and the staff that were filling it in found it extremely difficult to accept that people discriminated on gender, for example, because, as they said, it's illegal, so it doesn't happen. It shouldn't happen, therefore there's no discrimination going on here. And that's another thing that we've uncovered. There's a slight sort of deafness around sexual harassment. It's wrong, it shouldn't be happening, it's too tricky, I'd rather not hear about it. So we need to question whether we want to hear. In risk, this is the capacity to empathise with how risky people might find it to speak up to me. And a question that I will pose in just a little bit is, who finds you scary to talk to? And again, you might be thinking, oh no, come on, I'm lovely. People will always speak to me, I'm always friendly. Well, even if you are, you will be somebody's boss, or you'll be friends of somebody, or you'll be a particular gender, or whatever it is. Some people will think twice before they speak to you. And we can't help some of that, but we can appreciate it and empathise and understand it. We've certainly, in the conversations that I've had, many of the perpetrators of sexual harassment are bosses. And then women have often had to go up the chain to speak to the boss's boss. And that can feel enormously scary. So if you are the boss's boss, bear in mind that anybody that wants to speak up to you about sexual harassment or any other subject may be really thinking twice about it. So you have to be quite skillful in terms of showing your approachability. And again, the story that I referred to before in Time magazine about the Mexican cleaner, it was, really made me think, because this cleaner, she said she couldn't say anything because it would be regarded as shameful in her culture that she'd been subjected to this. And B, she couldn't speak up because if she lost her job, she'd lose her funding. So, that's an intense pressure to stay silent. If we're in organisations or with people that are in those sorts of situations, the onus is on us to be incredibly skillful about how we appreciate risk and we provide support. So more about that in a little bit. Political awareness, knowing why people are telling you what they are and what they expect you to do with it. Now, there's a couple of things to say here. One is around examples where people have been told things informally down the pub. That's where a lot of these conversations seem to happen. They happen off the record. But if you're in a position of power your behavior in hearing these things is really important. You need to really accept either, do you then go and do something about it? If you don't, you're kind of condoning silencing and you're disappearing the issue. So that came up in terms of knowing why people are telling you what they are and what they expect you to do with it. And then also is the impression that, okay, well, many of these stories are coming out just because people, they're false, basically. And they come out when women want to be a bit vindictive, or they want to protect their jobs or something. There's a political reason for why they're saying it. Now, there are definitely occasions when false allegations are made for malicious reasons. And it is necessary to see when that's the case, definitely. It seems that the public impression that false claims are common is not well placed, though. It's quite tricky to find any research on sexual harassment claims, but research for the Home Office in the UK suggested that only 4% of cases of sexual violence reported to the UK police are found or suspected to be false. And studies carried out in Europe and in the US indicate rates of between 2 and 6% of false accusations. So what I've heard as a sort of excuse sometimes that, oh, well, there's lots of made up stories here. Actually, the balance of favour is in them being true. And we need to remember that. Social awareness. So again, we're talking about labels here. Now, if you occupy the label of HR or in charge of the whistleblowing line or boss, what does that mean in terms of people's capacity to come and speak to you about sexual harassment? Is that the done thing? Is it in your organisation or is it not? I've been working, in the wider Speaking Truth to Power project with HR teams, trying to understand, what does HR mean? Does it mean, okay, they're the people that fire me, or they're the people that are responsible for my performance management? Or does it mean, oh, they're the people that are really there to support and coach me? It may mean a mixture of those things, but you need to understand what labels are applied to you and what does that mean in terms of people's capacity to speak to you about this particular subject. What labels do you own, in other words? So if you're described as connected politically, if you're described as male or female or busy, all of these labels mean and have consequences on whether people will talk to you. And they're very ingrained, particularly gendered labels, extremely ingrained, and they'll take quite a while for us to alter and change. We had an activist investor, part of our interviewing process in the US, and she spoke, she's in charge of trillions of dollars, or a lot of money, and obviously she needs to make sure that where she's investing that money, the leadership teams are doing some good work. But she said that whenever she enters the boardrooms, the two labels that are applied to her almost immediately are young and woman. And whereas there may be some context where those phrases, those labels convey status, the boardrooms aren't one of them. And she was talking about, as a woman and as a young woman, the only way she gets heard in that context is when she forms alliances. She goes to speak one-on-one with people. She finds out what people think and gets people on board before she brings things to the wider group. So, when you hear things like that, it's no surprise really that women don't speak up or don't get heard or taken seriously. So we need to examine what role labels have to play in this. And then finally, judgment. Knowing how to help people to speak up to me. I think we've kind of covered some of this, and the skill and the awareness that's required to really invite people well, to have time to notice whether they've got something to say to you, and we're running around like mad things inside our organizations. It's quite easy to miss the expression in someone's face that says there's something going on, and they're finding it tricky to speak up to you. You know, we have to have a bit of an antennae, a radar that's going at least some of the time to pick up some of these signals. And then just kind of being sensible about our responses here. We had a US vice president that we spoke to, who said, well, his response is he won't have lunch with a woman that's not his wife. And, you know, I kind of understand where he was coming from. He had sort of some good intentions on that front. But of course, what he's basically conveying that he's legitimizing seeing women as a sexual object there. And an MD, similarly, MD at a big accountancy firm, saying that he'll meet male colleagues at his home office, but not female. Now, this is so hard. You know, we've got men on the one hand trying to do something whereby they won't be, in a way, caught out by this or accused of anything, or never putting themselves in a circumstance where they might be judged. But of course, the consequences are we're disappearing women from very important networking. You know, a lot of business gets done in the pub after work. And if suddenly the women aren't invited, it has consequences. So it really opened up to me, certainly listening to this, how tricky it is to navigate through this and to try and do the right thing. One other example that I'll say in terms of judgment, you know, here's an example of how not to help somebody speak up. So a pharmaceutical company where a woman was being propositioned by a key customer. So this customer was quite an influential one, quite an important one. So the boss's agenda was firmly on winning sales. So when this lady spoke to her boss, the response was, this is the first response, well, are you sure you didn't encourage him in some ways? Guess what? Woman was silenced, didn't say anything else. So, you know, these moments, these momentary points of responses, you know, not only does that silence that woman, but of course then those stories are shared inside an organization, and before you know it, you have silenced far more than one voice. Now, we can't all be perfect, but we have to fine tune our, again, antennae around this and really think through what our responses are. And that's where, I suppose, that's where my other research on mindfulness comes in. You know, stop acting in default and just take a moment to choose your response. These moments are incredibly important. So there's just 3 traps. If you're interested in this, I did a TEDx talk at the end of last year that goes through these in more details, but they are applicable here. When you're in a position of power, and I reiterate, that will mean every single person on this phone call, because somebody somewhere perceives us as powerful, no matter what role or what position we're in. We forget how scary we are. And in doing that, we don't do some of the things that we need to invite other people successfully to speak to us. So we have to have this capacity to put ourselves in other people's shoes, and then to put those people at their ease. So, you know, think through, if you're in an organization, who in the organization will really think twice before they speak up if they're suffering sexual harassment? And how would that be? What would that be like? How on earth, and how can you reach them and in a way that allows them to speak up? So that's the first trap. Second trap is we don't question our little list of whose opinion counts. And we spoke to a chief executive who said all the right things in relation to diversity and listening to people, and it was so important, everybody's opinion counts. And then paused for a little bit and then said, yes, but I do have a little list. of the people who sort of count more than others. And I referred to this earlier on. You know, we all have a little list because it's human. So just we need to take care and be mindful of our lists and our labels, and we need to question them. So just questioning, okay, well, who do I think I want to listen to and who don't I want to listen to, and what's that based on? And what consequences does it have? Because I can tell you the people on the receiving end can sense it. And then you've got trap 3, which is, well, we send shut up signals, not speak up signals so much of the time. And I've spoken about this, about being mindful. You know, we need to know our signals. You've probably got, you know, you will have had in your time a few people that have spent several weeks plucking up the courage to say something to you about something. And in they come to your office and they open their mouth, but then you're frowning at them like hell or running off to another meeting, and the wind goes out of their sails and then they don't say something. So we just have to make sure that at least some of the times, we can't do it all the time, we know what signals we're sending. And we, you know, if we mess up, quite frankly, like that boss I talked about in the pharma industry, you know, okay, if he slipped up, what he needs to do is then go back and say, I am so sorry about that first response I gave to you. Talk to me. Tell me more. Let's figure out what we can do. For goodness sake, make amends. So there's some traps. And then on to, so these are 5 areas, on to what you can do. So we're working on the broader area of speaking truth to power, and this applies within the sexual harassment area. Individual levels, helping individuals, at team levels, and also at organizational levels. And these are some of the things that we're getting involved in. So I think the first thing, the most obvious thing to say here is actually, first off, there are no silver bullets. Apologies, sorry, if that was the point that you were waiting for in the webinar. I have to just tell it to you straight. It is so complex and subjective and contextual. I can't say, do this, it'll work. But we've got some very good examples of what types of things seem to make a difference. And it's rarely around asking people to be courageous and speaking up. So first of all, we've got processes and procedures, things like support lines, training, surveys, and policies, so sexual harassment policies. In this HBR article on the restaurant industry, it stated that employees are more likely to engage in sexual harassment when they perceive that their organisation accepts, ignores, or doesn't care about it. So restaurants need to make clear to all employees and managers that sexual harassment will not be tolerated, policies and procedures and support. So there's stuff that you very visibly do that sends messages in this area. On the other hand, of course, we can't just be naively puritanical about it and say that, you know, by the way, you can't be attracted to one another in the workplace. That's not going to go anywhere. We can't put everything in contractual terms. We can't, you know, draw hard lines very often and detailed rules that cover all eventualities. But training is really important here as well. And in particular, understanding all of our responsibility to speak up when we're bystanders. So men and women, understanding it's, you know, this is a shared responsibility. Inaction equals condoning. So that's something that I think is probably worth reiterating a little bit more. Education and diagnostics. So we've been running workshops on speaking up generally and getting people to share stories and using diagnostics to help people understand what's going on in the workplace. And that connected with inquiry-based interventions really raise people's awareness. So you start by saying, you know, what's it like? What's it like for you? You know, and sharing stories amongst people from very different areas so that we develop appreciation and empathy. And inquiry-based interventions over time can gradually change the systems that they're in. And also alter what it's okay to talk about. So, you know, we can't do anything about sexual harassment if everybody's too, you know, feels too awkward to have the conversation in the first place. which is a big issue, because even I, doing a webinar on the subject, feel a bit tentative about it, because I think it's such a hot debate that I think everybody's a bit worried about saying something out of turn. So somehow we've got to be able to have conversations, because if we can't have conversations, we can't do anything about it. So that's where the inquiry-based interventions sit in. I've worked with a number of teams using mindfulness to enable them to stop in the moment of responding, of reacting rather, and choosing responses. So this is around the signals we send, and what they mean in the wider system. And then also we've been doing coaching on an individual and group level. And systemic reviews is about understanding what else the system says about this area. So in the wider context of speaking up, it's all very well to say that everybody's opinion counts and they need to speak up. But if you don't reward that in a performance management process, then that can be really empty words. So things in the system all have to sort of kind of point towards the same direction. And, finally, I'd say, these, I hope from this webinar that you've got the idea that these labels are really tricky to change. And it's going to take a lot of patience and persistence and prioritization to change anything here. If you do have a question, please type it in now. I'm not seeing one at the moment, so I'll start concluding. But if you do have any questions, please, you really do need to type it in now. But in conclusion, look, in a nutshell, as we've conducted more and more research into this specific area of speaking up and silencing, what I would say is, my conclusion is, oh my goodness, it's enormously subjective and contextual and complex. So we are in a process of socially constructing what's okay and what's not. And we've been doing that forever, but perhaps at the moment it's more obvious. So in order to navigate this way, it does help if we, I think, to have inquiry-based conversations rather than knee-jerk blame or finger pointing, which tends to just silence people, actually. So the more we can change conversations about it, the better. Sexual harassment is a particular, as far as myself and John is concerned, we see it as a particular form of the misuse of power, where people are not realizing how powerful they are in the eyes of others, or they're taking advantage of it. So yes, people need to speak up about sexual harassment, and that doesn't just mean the victim of it. But we really, if we're in positions of power, need to listen up extremely well. So I hope in the end that you have enjoyed some of that conversation and been, at least it's proved at least thought-provoking. There's my contact details. There's a few other resources for you. There's a couple of HBR articles, a research report, and a book that's coming out in March, but also my contact details. And I would love to hear from you. If you have a story here, can you please contact me, let me know if I haven't covered something that you'd like me to cover. Then again, drop me a line and I will get back to you. So I'm now seeing, with 1 minute to go, some questions which are really interesting here. And if I can't cover them now, I would say, yeah, I'm seeing yours, Georgina, for example. What risks are there, if any, to developing a culture of overly PC? Yes, absolutely. But my goodness, if that's stopping us having the conversation in the first place, that's quite worrying. There's risks everywhere. It's so subjective. So what some people perceive as overly PC, other people will see as perfectly correct and the right thing to do. So all I can say here is you're never going to please everybody at the same time, because it is so subjective. But at least we should be having the conversations that get into some of that complexity and raise our awareness so that we can make decent choices about what to do. So I need to finish there, guys. I hope you have a good rest of your day. And as I said, if you're interested in the subject, please do get in touch and keep an eye on the research, because it's very much still happening for the rest of this year. Thank you very much, everybody.